The Grey King, Day 4, Bird Rock. There was no way of telling whether they were deep inside Craigyard Adrian or had walked through the grey rocky doors into another place in time. It did not matter to Will. Exhilaration was pulsing through him in this the true beginning of his first full quest as an old one. Turning to look back, he saw without surprise that the doors through which they had come were no longer there. The rock wall at the end of the chamber where they now stood was smooth and unbroken, and upon it, high up there, hung a round golden shield, glinting dully in the light that came from somewhere deep within the room. Will looked tentatively at Bran, but the Welsh boy seemed unperturbed. His face was oddly vulnerable without its protective glasses, but Will could read no expression in the cat-like eyes. He felt once more an intense curiosity about the strange boy with no color in him, born into the dark, haunted valley, mortal, and yet also a creature foreknown by the Old One centuries before. How was it that he, Will, an old one himself, could sense so little of Bran's nature? "You okay?" he said. "I'm all right," said Bran. He was looking up at the walls beyond Will. "View," he said softly. "Beautiful. Look at those." It was a long, empty room. On its walls hung four tapestries, two to each side, their rich colors so deeply gleaming that they, too, seemed to shimmer in the half-light, like the golden shield. Will blinked in recognition at the images embroidered there, rich as stained glass, a silver unicorn, a field of red roses, a glowing golden sun. All the light in this room seemed, he now saw, to come from only one flame. In an iron holder, jutting from the stone wall near the end of the room, a single tremendous candle stood. It was several feet high, and it burned with a white, unwavering flame of intense brilliance. The long shadow of the candle lay over wall and floor, motionless, undancing. Its stillness, Will realized, was the stillness of the high magic, a power beyond light or dark, or any allegiance, the strongest and most remote force in the universe, which soon in this place he and Bran must face. There was a faint whistling whine at his side, scarcely audible. He looked down and saw the dog Kafal gazing backwards at Bran. Will said softly, "Go on, then." The dog's cold nose nudged his hand, and Kafal turned and trotted briskly back to his master, waving his tail. Bran thrust his fingers into the fur of the dog's head in quick, fierce affection, and Will knew that for all his calm appearance there was in his mind an uncertainty approaching panic, which Kafal had sensed and sought to reassure. Will felt a quick tug of sympathy for Bran, but there was no time for explanations. He knew he must trust his instinctive feeling that, in the last resort, the strange remoteness always apparent to Bran would prove to be the strangeness of great strength. He said aloud, without turning, "This way." Then he walked firmly down the long, lofty chamber. Bran followed with Kafal. Will could hear the footsteps ringing with his own on the stone-paved floor. He reached the tall candle in the wall. Its iron holder was set in the stone at the level of his shoulder, and the smooth white sides of the candle reached far higher, high above his head, so that the white flame glowed up there like a bright full moon. Will paused. "First the moon," he said, "then the stars, and if all is well, a comet, and then the dust of the stars, and at last the sun." "What?" said Bran. Will glanced across without really seeing. Behind his eyes he was looking into his own mind and memory, not at Bran. Here in this place he was an old one, occupied with affairs of the light. Nothing else had very much relevance. He said, "It is the order of things by which the high magic shall be known, so that none may come within reach of it, except by birthright." Bran said, "I still don't know what you're talking about." Then he shook his head in quick, nervous apology. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound—" "It doesn't matter," Will said. "Just follow. You'll see." The footsteps rang out again, and they were at the end of the long room, and there was nothing before them but a blank hole in the floor. Bran peered at it dubiously. Will said, "Do what I do." He sat on the edge of the rough rectangular opening in the floor, and in a few moments he could see a staircase running downwards at a steep angle. Cautiously lowering himself, he found the stairway was narrow and dark. It was like going down into a well. When he put out a hand to either side, each hand at once touched rock, and the rock of the roof, too, was very close to his head. He went slowly down. In a moment he could hear Bran's careful steps following and the soft scratch of Kafal's paws. For a little while the glimmer from the upper chamber reached down after them, casting wavering patterns of shadow on the close walls, but soon even that faded, and there was no light in the stair tunnel at all. In its sides Will's fingers found two smooth channels, carved to form balustrades, a steadying refuge for the hands of anyone descending. He said quietly, his voice eerily echoing, "Bran, if you put your hands out." "I found them," Bran said. "Like banisters, aren't they? Bright idea if somebody's that." The words were cool, but there was tension behind them. Their voices boomed gently in the stairway, muffled as if by mist. Will said, "Go carefully. I may stop in a hurry." He was straining to hear the voice of his instincts. Random images and impressions flickered in and out of his mind. Something was calling him, something close, close. He put out a hand in front of him, just in time to save himself from coming hard up against a blank wall of rock. There was no other stair ahead, only a stony dead end. "What is it?" said Bran behind. "Wait a moment." and instruction was growing inside Will's memory. Like an echo from another world, standing with his feet planted firmly on the last stair, he put the palms of both hands flat against the rough, unseen rock face, barring their way, and he pushed. At the same time, he said certain words in the old speech that came into his mind, and the rock parted, silently, as it had when the great doors opened silently on Bird Rock, though no music sounded here. With Bran and Kafal at his heels, Will stepped forward into a faint glow of light that caught him into such wonder that he could only stand and gaze. They were no longer where they had been. They stood somewhere in another time, on the roof of the world. All around them was the open night sky, like a huge black inverted bowl, and in it blazed the stars, thousand upon thousand brilliant prickles of fire. Will heard Bran draw in a quick breath. They stood, looking up. The stars blazed round them. There was no sound anywhere. In all the immensity of space, Will felt a wave of giddiness. It was as though they stood on the last edge of the universe, and if they fell, they would fall out of time. And he gazed about him. Gradually he recognized the strange inversion of reality in which they were held. He and Bran were not standing in a timeless, dark night observing the stars in the heavens. It was the other way around. They themselves were observed. Every blazing point in that great, deathless hemisphere of stars and suns was focused upon them, contemplating, considering, judging. For by following the quest for the golden harp, he and Bran were challenging the boundless might of the high magic of the universe. They must stand unprotected before it, on their way, and they would be allowed to pass only if they had the right by birth. Under that merciless starlight of infinity, any unrightful challenger would be brushed into nothingness as effortlessly as a man might brush an ant from his sleeve. Will stood waiting. There was nothing else that he could do. He looked for friends in the sky. He found the eagle and the bull, with Edelbaron glowing red and the Pleiades glimmering. He saw Orion brandish his club high, encouraging, with Betelgeuse and Rigel winking at shoulder and toe. He saw the swan and the eagle flying towards one another along the bright path of the Milky Way. He saw the hazy hint of distant Andromeda and Earth's near neighbors, Tau, Ceti, and Procyon, and Sirius, the dog star. In longing hope Will gazed at them, in hope and in salutation, for during his time of learning the ways of an old one he had flown amongst them all. Then the sky wheeled and the stars slanted and changed. Now the centaur galloped overhead, and the blue double star of Acrix supporting the Southern Cross. The Hydra stretched lazily over the heavens, and the lion marching by, and the great ship sailed its leisurely, eternal way. And at last a brilliant point of light, with a long curving tail, came blazing into view over half the inverted bowl of the sky, moving past in a long, stately progress, and Will knew that he and Bran had survived their first ordeal. He pressed Bran's arm briefly, and saw a flicker of reflected light as the white head turned. "It's a comet," Bran whispered. Will said softly back, "Wait, there's more, if all is well." The long flaring tail of the comet moved gradually out of sight, down over the horizon of their nameless world, in time. Still in the black hemisphere, the stars blazed and slowly wheeled beneath them. Will felt so infinitesimally small that it seemed impossible he should even exist. Immensity pressed in on him, terrifying, threatening, and then, in a swift flash of movement like dance, like the glint of leaping fish, came a flick of brightness in the sky from a shooting star. Then another, and another, here, there, all around. He heard Bran give a small chirrup of delight. A spark struck from the same bright, sudden joy that filled his own being. "Wish on a star," said a tiny voice in his head from some long-departed day of early childhood. "Wish on a star," the cry of a pleasure and faint as ancient as the eyes of man. "Wish on a falling star," said Bran, soft in his ear. All around them the meteors briefly divided and vanished, as tiny points of stardust in the long travel of their clouds struck the airy halo of the earth, burned bright, and were gone. "I wish," said Will fiercely in his mind. "I wish. Oh, I wish." And all the bright starlit sky was gone in a flicker of time that they could not catch, and darkness came around them so fast that they blinked in disbelief at its thick nothingness. They were back on the staircase beneath Bird Rock, with stone steps under their feet and a curved stone balustrade smoothed to the sightless touch of their hands. And as Will stretched out one hand groping before him, he found no blank wall of stone there to bar his way, but free open space. Slowly, faltering, he went on down the dark stairway, and Bran and Kafal followed him. Then gradually faint light began to filter up from below. Will saw a glimmer from the walls enclosing them, and then the shape of the steps beneath his feet. Then appearing round a curve in the long tunneling stairway, the bright circle that marked its end. The light grew brighter, the circle larger. Will felt his steps become quicker and more eager, and mocked himself, but could not help it. Then instinct caught him into caution, and the last few steps of the staircase before the light, he stopped. Behind him he heard Bran and the dog stop too, at once. Will stood listening to his senses, trying to catch the source of warning. He saw, without properly seeing that the steps on which they stood had been carved out of the rock with immense care and symmetry, perfectly angled, smooth as glass, every detail as clear as if the rock had been cut only the day before. Yet there was a noticeable hollow in the center of each step, which could only have been worn by centuries of passing feet. Then he ceased to notice such things, for awareness caught at him out of the deepest corner of his mind and told him what he must do. Carefully, Will pushed up the left sleeve of his sweater as far as the elbow, leaving the forearm bare. On the underside of his arm shone the livid scar that had once been accidentally burned there like a brand, the sign of the light, a circle quartered by a cross. In a deliberate, slow gesture, half defensive, half defiant, he raised his arm crooked before his face, as if shielding his eyes from bright light or warding off an unexpected blow. Then he walked down the last few steps of the staircase, out into the light. As he stepped to the floor, he felt a shock of sensation like nothing he had ever known. A flare of white brilliance blinded him and was gone. A brief, tremendous thunder dazed his ears and was gone. A force like a blast wave from some great explosion briefly tore at his body and was gone. Will stood still, breathing fast. He knew that beneath his singular protection he had brought them through the last door of the high magic, a living barrier that would consume any unsought intruder in a gasp of energy as unthinkable as the holocaust of the sun. Then he looked into the room before him, and for a moment of illusion thought that he saw the sun itself. It was an immense cavernous room, high-roofed, lit by flaring torches thrust into brackets on the stone walls and hazy with smoke. The smoke came from the torches, yet in the center of the floor burned a great glowing fire, alone, with no chimney or fireplace to contain it. It gave no smoke at all, but burned with a white light of such brilliance that Will could not look straight at it. No intense heat came from the fire, but the air was filled with aromatic scent of burning wood, and there was the crackling, snapping sound of a log fire. Will came forward past the fire, beckoning Bran to follow, then stopped abruptly as he saw what lay ahead. Hazy at the end of the chamber, 3 figures sat, in 3 gray thrones that seemed to be fashioned out of smooth gray-blue Welsh slate. They did not move. They appeared to be men, dressed in long, hooded robes of differing shades of blue. One robe was dark, one was light, and the robe between them was shifting greenish blue of summer sea. Between the 3 thrones stood 2 intricately carved wooden chests. At first there seemed to be nothing else in the huge room, but after a moment of gazing, Will knew that there was a movement in the deep shadows beyond the fire, in the darkness all around the 3 illuminated lords. These were the bright figures on a dark canvas, lit to catch the eye. Beyond them in the darkness other things of unknown nature lurked. He could tell nothing of the nature of the 3 figures, beyond sensing great power, nor could his senses, as an old one, penetrate the surrounding darkness. It was as if an invisible barrier stood all around them, through which no enchantment might reach. Will stood a little way before the thrones, looking up. The faces of the 3 lords were hidden in the shadows of their hooded robes. For a moment there was silence, broken only by a soft crackle of the burning fire. Then out of the shadows a deep voice said, "We greet you, Will Stanton, and we name you by the sign, Will Stanton, Sign Seeker." "Greetings," Will said in a strong and clear a voice as he could muster, and he pulled down his sleeve over his scarred arm. "My lords," he said, "it is the Day of the Dead." "Yes," said the figure in the highest blue robe. His face seemed thin in the shadows of his hood, the eyes gleaming, and his voice was light, sibilant, hissing. "Yes." Echoes whispered like snakes out of the dark, as if 100 other little hissing sounds came from nameless shapes behind him, and Will felt the small hairs rise on the back of his neck. Behind him he heard Bran give a muffled, involuntary moan, and knew that horror must be creeping like a white mist through his mind. Will's strength as an old one rebelled. He said in quick, cold reproach, "My lord." The horror fell away like a cloud whisked off by the wind, and the lord in the light blue robe softly laughed. Will stood there frowning at him, unmoved, a small stocky boy in jeans and sweater, who nonetheless knew himself to possess power worthy of meeting these 3. He said confident now, "It is the Day of the Dead, and the youngest has opened the oldest hills through the door of the birds, and has been let pass by the eye of the high magic. I have come for the golden harp, my lords." The second figure in the sea blue robe said, "And the raven boy with you?" "Yes." Will turned to Bran, standing hesitantly nearer the fire, and beckoned him. Bran came forward very slowly, feet as unwilling as if they swam against treacle, and stood at his side. The light from the torches on the wall shone in his white hair. The lord in the sea blue robe leaned forward a little from his throne. They glimpsed a keen, strong face and a pointed gray beard. He said astonishingly, "Kafaw?" At Bran's side the white dog stood erect and quivering. He did not move an inch forward, as if obeying some inner instruction that told him his place, but his tail waved furiously from side to side as it never waved for anyone but Bran. He gave a soft, small whine. White teeth glinted in the hooded face. "He is well named, well named," Bran said jealously in sudden fierce anxiety. "He is my dog." Then he added rather muffled, "My lord." Will could feel the alarm in him at his own temerity, but the laughter from the shadows was kindly. Never fear, boy. The high magic would never take your dog from you. Certainly the old ones would not either, and the dark might try, but would not succeed. He leaned forward suddenly so that for an instant the strong, bearded face was clear, the voice softened, and there was an aching sadness in it. Only the creatures of the earth may take from one another, boy. All creatures, but men more than any. Life they take, and liberty, and all that another man may have. Sometimes through greed, sometimes through stupidity, but never by any volition but their own. Beware your own race, Bran Davies. They are the only ones who will ever harm you, in the end. Dread stirred in Will as he felt the deep sadness in the voice, for there was a compassion in it directed solely at Bran, as if the Welsh boy stood at the edge of some long sorrow. He had a quick sense of mysterious closeness between these two, and knew that the Lord in the sea-blue robe was trying to give Bran strength and help without being able to explain why. Then the hooded figure leaned abruptly back, and the mood was gone. Will said huskily, "Nevertheless, my lord, the rights of that race has always been the business of the light, and in quest of them I claim the golden harp." The soft-voiced lord in the lightest robe, who had spoken first, swiftly stood. His cloak swirled round him like a blue mist. Bright eyes glinted from the thin, pale face glimmering in the hood. "Answer the three riddles as the law demands, old one. You and the white crow, your helper there, and the harp shall be yours. But if you answer wrong, the doors of rock shall close, and you be left defenseless in the cold mountain, and the harp shall be lost to the light forever." "We shall answer," Will said. "You, boy, the first." The blue mist swirled again. A bony finger was thrusting, pointing at Bran, and the shadowed hood turned. Will turned too, anxiously. He half expected this. Bran gasped. "Me? But I—" Will reached out and touched his arm. He said gently, "Try, only try. We are here only to try. If the answer is asleep in you, it will wake. If it is not, no matter. But try." Bran stared at him, unsmiling, and Will saw his throat move as he swallowed. Then the white head turned back again. "All right." The soft, sibilant voice said, "Who are the three elders of the world?" Will felt Bran's mind reel in panic, and he tried to find meaning in the words. There was no way to offer help. In this place, the law of the high magic prevented an old one from putting the smallest thought or image in another mind. Will was permitted only to overhear. So tense, he stood overhearing the turmoil of his friends' thoughts as they tossed about desperately seeking order. Bran struggled. The three elders of the world. Somewhere he knew. It was strange and yet familiar, as if somewhere he had seen or read. The three oldest creatures, the three oldest things. He had read it at school, and he had read it in Welsh. The oldest things. He took his glasses from his shirt pocket, as if fiddling with them could clear his mind, and he saw staring up out of them the reflection of his own eyes. Strange eyes, creepy eyes. They called them at school. Strange, round, tawny eyes like the eyes of an owl. He put the glasses slowly back in his pocket, his mind groping at an echo. At his side, Kafal shifted very slightly, his head moving so that it touched Bran's hand. The fur brushed his fingers lightly, very lightly, like the flick of feathers. Feathers. He had it. Will, at his side, felt in his own mind the echoing flood of relief and struggled to contain his delight. Bran stood up straight and cleared his throat. "The three elders of the world," he said, "are the owl of Quim Calawid, the eagle of Gernaboy, and the blackbird of Kelly Gardan." Will said softly, "Oh, well done, well done." "That is right," said the thin voice above them, unemotionally. Like an early morning sky, the light blue robe swirled before them, and the figure sank back into its throne. From the central throne rose the Lord in the sea-blue robe, stepping forward. He looked down at Will. Behind its gray beard, his face seemed oddly young, though its skin was brown and weathered like the skin of a sailor along at sea. "Will Stanton," he said, "who were the three generous men of the island of Britain?" Will stared at him. The riddle was not impossible. He knew that the answer lay somewhere in his memory, stored from the great book of Grimmar, the treasured book of the enchantment of the light that had been destroyed as soon as he, the last of the old ones, had been shown what it held. Will set his mind to work searching, but at the same time a deeper riddle worried at him. Who was this lord in the sea-blue robe, with his close interest in Bran? He knew about Kafal. Clearly he was a lord of the high magic, and yet there was a look about him of. Will pushed wondering aside. The answer to the riddle had surfaced in his memory. He said clearly, "The three generous men of the island of Britain. Nud the generous, son of Sanilt. Mordoth the generous, son of Serwan. Ridurk the generous, son of Tudwal Tudglid. And Arthur himself was more generous than the three." Deliberately on the last line his voice rang echoing through the hall like a bell. "That is right," said the bearded lord. He looked thoughtfully at Will and seemed about to say more, but instead he only nodded slowly. Then sweeping his robe about him in a sea-blue wave, he stepped back to his throne. The hall seemed darker, filled with dancing shadows from the flickering light of the fire. A sudden flash and crackle came from behind the boys. As a log fell and the flames leapt up, instinctively Will glanced back. When he turned forward again, the third figure, who had not spoken or moved until now, was standing tall and silent before his throne. His robe was a deep, deep blue, darkest of the three, and his hood was pulled so far forward that there was no hint of his face visible, but only shadow. His voice was deep and resonant, like the voice of a cello, and it brought music into the hall. "Will Stanton," it said, "what is the shore that fears the sea?" Will stared impulsively forward, his hands clenching into his fists, for his voice caught into the deepest part of him. Surely, surely, but the face in the hood was hidden, and he was denied all the ways of recognition. Any part of his senses that tried to reach out to the great thrones met a blank wall of refusal from the high magic. Once more Will gave up and put his mind to the last riddle. He said slowly, "The shore that fears the sea." Images wavered in and out of his mind, great crashing waves against a rocky coast, the green light in the ocean, the realm of Tethys, where strange creatures may live, a gentler sea then, washing in long, slow waves, an endless golden beach. The shore, the beach, the beach. The image wavered and changed. It dissolved into a green dappled forest of gnarled ancient trees, the broad trunk smooth with a curious light gray bark. Their leaves danced above, new, soft, bright, with a delicate green that had in it all of springtime. The beginnings of triumph whispered in Will's mind. "The shore," he said, "the beach where the sea washes, but also it is a wood of lovely fine grain, and that is in the handle of a chisel, in the legs of a chair, the head of a broom, and the pad of a workhorse saddle. And I dare swear, too, that those two chests between your thrones are carved of it. The only places where it may not be used are beneath the open sky and upon the open sea, for this wood loses its virtue if soaked by water. The answer to your riddle, my lord, is the wood of the beech tree." The flames leapt up in the fire behind them, and suddenly the hall was brilliant. Joy and relief seemed to surge through the air. The first two blue-robed lords rose from their thrones to stand beside the third. Like three towers, they loomed hooded over the boys. Then the third lord flung back the hood of his deep blue robe to reveal a fierce, hawk-nosed head with deepest eyes and the shock of wild white hair, and the high magic's barrier against recognition fell away. Will cried joyously, "Merriman!" He leapt forward to the tallest figure as a small child leaps to its father, and clasped his outstretched hands. Merriman smiled down at him. Will laughed aloud in delight. "I knew," he said, "I knew, and yet—" "Greetings, old one," Merriman said. "Now you are grown fully into the circle by this. Had you failed in this part of the quest, all else would have been lost." The bleak, hard lines of his face were softened by affection. His dark eyes blazed like black torches. Then he turned to Bran, taking him by the shoulders. Bran looked up at him, pale and expressionless. "And the Raven boy," the deep voice said gently. "We meet again. You have played your part well, as it is known you would. Hold your head in pride, Bran Davies. You carry a great heritage within you. Much has been asked of you, and more will be asked yet. Much more." Bran looked at Merriman with his cat-like eyes unblinking and said nothing. Listening to the Welsh boy's mood, Will sensed an uneasy, baffled pleasure. Merriman stepped back. He said, "The three lords of the High Magic have for many centuries had guardianship of the Golden Harp. There are no names here in this place, nor allegiances in that task. Here, as in other places that you do not know yet, all is subject to the law, the high law. It is of no consequence that I am the Lord of the Light, or that my colleague there is the Lord of the Dark." He made a slight, ironic bow to the tall figure who wore the robe of lightest blue. Will caught his breath in sudden comprehension and looked for the thin face hidden in the hood, but it was turned away from him, staring out into the shadows of the hall. The central figure in the sea-blue robe stepped forward a pace. There was a great, quiet authority about him, as if he were confident, without pomp. And knowing himself the master in that hall, he put back his hood, and they saw the full strength and gentleness of the close, bearded face. Though his beard was gray, his hair was brown, only lightly gray-streaked. He seemed a man in the middle of his years, with all power undiminished, yet wisdom already gained. But Will thought, "He is not a man at all." Merriman inclined his head respectfully, stepping aside. "Sire," he said. Will stared at last, beginning to understand. At Bran's side, the dog Fall made the same small sound of devotion that he had before. Clear blue eyes looked down at Bran, and the bearded lord said softly, "Fortune guard you in my land, my son." Then, as Bran looked at him perplexed, the lord drew himself up, and the voice rose. "Will Stanton," he said, "two chests stand between our thrones. You must open the chest at my right, and take out what you will find there. The other will remain sealed in case of need, until another time that I may hope may never come. Here now." He turned, pointing. Will went to the big carved chest, turned its ornate wrought iron clasp, and pushed at the top. It was so broad and the carved slab of wood so heavy that he had to kneel and push upward with all the force of both arms. But he shook his head in warning refusal when Bran started forward to help. Slowly the huge lid rose and fell open, and for a moment there was a delicate sound like singing in the air. Then Will reached inside the chest, and when he straightened again, he was bearing in both arms a small, gleaming gold harp. The hint of music in the hall died into nothing, giving way to a low growing rumble, like a distant thunder. Closer and louder it grew. The Lord in the lightest sky-blue robe, his face still hooded and hidden, drew away from them. He seized his cloak and swung it around him with a long sweep of the arm. The fire hissed and went out. Smoke filled the hall, dark and bitter. Thunder crashed and roared all around, and the Lord in the sky-blue robe gave a great cry of rage and disappeared. Eyes that see the wind. They stood silent in the dim-lit darkness. Somewhere out beyond the rock, thunder still rumbled and growled. The torches burned, flickering and smoky on the walls. Bran said huskily, "Was he the... No," Merriman said. "He's not the great king, but he is one very close to him, and back to him he has gone now. And the rage will mount the higher, because it will be sharpened by fear at what the light may be able to do with this new thing of power." He looked at Will, his bony face tight with concern. "The first perilous part of the quest is accomplished, old one, but there is worse peril yet to come. The sleepers must be awakened." Will said, "That is right, and although we do not yet know where they sleep, nor shall till you have found them, it is almost certain that they are terribly, dangerously close to the Grey King. For long we have known there was a reason for his hard, cold grip on this part of the land, though we did not understand it. A happy valley, this has always been, and beautiful, yet he chose to make his kingdom here instead of some grim remote place of the kind chosen by most of his line. Now it is clear there can be only one reason for that, to be close to the place where the sleepers lie, and to keep their resting place within his power, just as this great rock, Craig Aederin, is still within his power." Will said, his round face grave. "The spell of protection by which we came here, untouched, has run its course now, and it can be made only once." He looked ruefully at Bran. "We may have an interesting reception out there when we leave this place. Have no care, old one. You will have a new protection with you now." The words came deep and gentle from the top of the hall. Turning, Will saw that the bearded lord, his robe blue as the summer sea, was sitting enthroned again in the shadows. As he spoke, it seemed that the light began gradually to grow in the hall. The torches burned higher, and glimmering between them now, Will could see long swords hanging on the stone. "The music of the golden harp," said the blue-robed lord, "has a power that may not be broken either by the dark or by the light. It has the high magic in it, and while the harp is being played, those under its protection are safe from any kind of harm or spell. Play the harp of gold, old one. Its music will wrap you in safety." Will said slowly, "By enchantment I could play it, but I think it should rather be played by the art of skillful fingers. I do not know how to play the harp, my lord." He paused, "but Bran does." Bran looked down at the instrument as Will held it out to him. "Never a harp like that, though," he said. He took the harp from Will. Its frame was slender but ornate, fashioned so that a golden vine with gold leaves and flowers seemed to twine round it, in and out of the strings. Even the strings themselves looked as if they were made of gold. "Play, Bran," said the bearded lord softly. Holding the harp experimentally in the crook of his left arm, Bran ran his fingers gently over the strings, and the sounds that came from them were of such sweetness that Will beside him caught his breath in astonishment. He had never heard notes at once so delicate and so resonant, filling the hall with music like the liquid bird-song of summer. Intent, fascinated, Bran began to pick at the plaintive notes of an old Welsh lullaby, elaborating and gradually filling it out as he gained confidence in the feel of the strings under his one hand. Will watched the absorbed musician's devotion on his face. Glancing for an instant at the enthroned lord and that Merriman, he knew that they too were for this moment rapt, carried away out of this time by a music that was not of the earth, pouring out like the high magic in a singing spell. Kafal made no sound, but leaned his head against Bran's knee. Merriman said, his deep voice soft over the music, "Go now, old one." His shadowed, deepest eyes met Will's briefly in a fierce communication of trust and hope. Will stared about him for a last moment at the high, torch-lit hall, which, with its one dark robed figure standing tall as a tree, and the unknown bearded lord seated motionless on his throne. Then he turned and led Bran, his fingers still gently plucking a melody from the harp, towards the narrow stone staircase to the chamber from which they had come. When he had set his high climbing, he turned to raise one arm in salute, then followed. Bran stood in the stone room above, playing, while Kafal and Will came up after him. As he played, there took shape in the blank wall at the end of the chamber, below the single hanging golden shield, the two great doors through which they had come into the heart of the Bird Rock. The music of the harp rippled in a lilting upward scale, and slowly the door swung inward. Beyond, they saw the gray, cloudy sky between the steep walls of the cleft of the rock. Though fire blazed no longer on the mountain, a strong dead smell of burning hung in the air. As they stepped outside, Kafal bounded out past them, through the cleft, and disappeared. Struck suddenly by a fear of losing him again, Bran stopped playing. "Kafal! Kafal!" he called. "Look! Will said softly. He was half turned, looking back. Behind them, the tall slabs of rock swung silently together and seemed to melt out of existence, leaving only a weathered rock face, looking just as it had looked for thousands of years. And in the air hung a faint, vanishing phrase of delicate music, but Bran was thinking only of Kafal. After one brief glance at the rock, he tucked the harp beneath his arm and dived for the opening through which the dog had disappeared. Before he could reach it, a whirling flurry of white came hurling in upon them through a cloud of fine ash, snarling, kicking, knocking Bran sideways so hard that he almost dropped the harp. It was Kafal, but a mad, furious, transformed Kafal, growling at them, glaring, driving them deeper in the cleft as if they were enemies. In a moment or two he had them pinned, astounded, against the rocky wall and was crouching before them with his long side teeth bared in a cold snarl. "What is it?" said Bran blankly, as when he had breath enough to speak. "Kafal, what on earth?" And in an instant they knew, or would have known, if they had time still for wondering, for suddenly the whole world round them was a roaring flurry of noise and destruction. Broken, charred branches came whirling past over the top of the rocky cleft. Stones came bounding down loose out of nowhere, so that instinctively they ducked, covering their heads. Covering their heads. They fell flat on the ground, pressing themselves into the angle beneath earth and rock, with Kafal all close behind. All around, the wind howled and tore at the rock with a sound like high, mad human scream, amplified beyond belief. It was as if all the air in Wales had funneled down into a great tornado of tearing destruction and was battering in a frenzy of frustrated rage at the narrow opening in whose shelter they desperately crouched. Will lurched up onto his hands and knees. He groped with one hand until he could clutch Bran's arm. "The harp," he croaked. "Play the harp." Bran blinked at him, dazed by the noise overhead, and then he understood. Forcing himself up against the fearsome wind pressing in between the rocky walls, he gripped the golden harp against his side and ran his right hand tremulously over the strings. At once the tumult grew less. Bran began to play, and as the sweet notes poured out like the song of a lark rising, the great wind died away into nothing. Outside there was only the rattle of loose pebbles tumbling here and there, one by one, down the rock. For a moment a lone sunbeam slanted down and glinted on the gold of the harp. Then it was gone, and the sky seemed duller, the world more gray. Kafal scrambled to his feet, licked Bran's hand, and led them docilely out to the slope outside the narrow cleft that had sheltered them from the fury of the gale. They felt the soft rain beginning to fall. Bran let his fingers wander idly, but persistently, over the strings of the harp. He had no intention of stopping again. He looked at Will and shook his head mutely with wonder and remorse and inquiry all in one. Will squatted down and took Kafal's muzzle between his hands. He shook the dog's head gently from side to side. "Kafal, Kafal," he said wonderingly. Over his shoulder he said to Bran, "Gwent tred Yai Mir. Is that how you say it?" In all its ancient force the Grey King sent his north wind upon us, the wind that blows round the feet of the dead, and with the dead is where we should have been if it weren't for Kafal, blasted away into a time beyond tomorrow. Before we could have seen a single tree bending, it would have been on us, for it came down from very high up, and no human-sighted eye could have seen it. But this hound of yours is the dog with the silver eyes, and such dogs can see the wind. So we saw it, and knew what it would do, and drove us back into safety." Bran said guiltily, "If I hadn't stopped playing, perhaps the Brennan Wood couldn't even have sent the wind. The magic of the harp would have stopped him." "Perhaps," Will said, "and perhaps not." He gave Kafal's head one last rub and straightened up. The white sheepdog looked up at Bran, tongue lolling as if in a grin, and Bran said to him lovingly, "Rit tid gid did da, good boy." But still his fingers did not stop moving over the harp.